Glass shattered against marble floors. Blood roared in her ears before blackness swallowed her whole. Diners screamed. Bodyguards drew weapons. He just stared, cold, calculating, unmoving. A ruthless underboss never cared about collateral damage. Yet, when his men kicked her spilled bag away, a cheap plastic baby bottle rolled across expensive tile, stopping at his polished leather shoe. Something shifted inside him. One tiny object broke an empire's rules. This is how monsters fall. Watch until our bitter end. Water seeped through a crack in the sole of Nora's left boot with every step she took. It was a cold, dirty city rain, the kind that smelled of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. She shivered, pulling her thin, oversized utility jacket tighter across her chest. Her canvas tote bag slapped heavily against her hip. Inside was a chaotic mess of her life. Final notice utility bills, a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers, a crushed tube of diaper cream, and a plastic baby bottle filled with powdered formula she had desperately scraped from the bottom of the tin. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Just half a piece of toast that Sam had rejected. The hunger had stopped being a sharp, gnawing pain hours ago. Now it was just a dull, echoing hollow in her center, accompanied by a persistent grey fuzz at the edges of her vision. Nora stopped outside the heavy oak and brass doors of L'Osteria. The glowing amber light from the windows spilled onto the wet pavement, a stark contrast to the miserable grey evening. She could smell it from the street, rich melted butter, roasted garlic, and the charred woodsy scent of an expensive hearth. Her stomach gave a violent, painful cramp. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, swallowing down a sudden surge of sour saliva. She shouldn't be here. The restaurant was strictly reservations only, catering to a clientele who wore watches that cost more than she would make in a decade. But Gregory was in there. Gregory, the floor manager, who had hired her under the table to scrub the grease traps and mop the freezer floors for the past month. He had fired her via a text message 3 days ago, right before rent was due, and had been ignoring her calls about her final $300 ever since. $300. To the people inside, it was the price of an appetizer and a cocktail. To Nora, it was the difference between Sam having a warm apartment next week, or them sleeping in her rusted Honda Civic. She pushed against the heavy brass handle. The door yielded with a smooth, silent glide, and the ambient noise of the restaurant washed over her. The clinking of crystal, the low murmur of self-important conversations, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. The air inside was suffocatingly warm and smelled of expensive cologne and truffles. Nora felt immediately, violently out of place. Her wet hair clung to her face in ratty strands. Her jeans were frayed at the hems, soaked with dirty rain. She left faint, damp footprints on the immaculate black marble floor. "Ma'am?" A host in a crisp tuxedo stepped into her path, his smile tight and his eyes scanning her with practiced disdain. "Are you lost? The delivery entrance is in the alley." "I need to speak to Gregory," Nora said. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. Her throat was bone dry. "Mr. Davis is currently attending to our VIP guests. If you'll just—" Nora didn't listen. She stepped around the host, her eyes scanning the dimly lit dining room. The layout felt like a maze of velvet booths and stark white tablecloths. Every step felt like walking through deep mud. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a rapid fluttering rhythm that made her chest ache. Hypoglycemia. A distant voice in her head noted. "You're crashing." She spotted him. Gregory was hovering near a large, secluded corner booth, a bottle of wine cradled in his hands. He was sweating, bowing his head obsequiously to the men seated around the table. Nora forced her legs to move. Just get the money. Just get the envelope and leave. She didn't look at the men at the table. She only focused on Gregory's balding head. But as she drew closer, the environment seemed to warp. The low light of the chandeliers flared into blinding, sickly yellow halos. The jazz music twisted into a distorted hum in her ears. "Gregory!" she croaked, reaching out. Gregory turned, his eyes widening in horror as he registered her presence. He opened his mouth to hiss an order, but Nora never heard it. The floor abruptly tilted at a 45-degree angle. Nora grabbed for the nearest solid object to keep from falling. Her fingers curled around the edge of a mahogany tray stand. It wasn't bolted down. Gravity ripped her downward. The stand tipped, taking a silver tray of full wine glasses with it. Crystal shattered against the marble with a deafening crash. Red wine exploded outward like a crime scene. Nora hit the floor hard, her knee taking the brunt of the impact, sending a blinding flash of pain up her thigh. Her canvas tote bag hit the ground violently, tipping over and vomiting its contents across the expensive tiles. The restaurant fell dead silent. The jazz music played on, oblivious. Nora lay there, the cold marble pressing against her burning cheek. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs refused to expand. Blackness crept in from the corners of her eyes, fast and merciless. Through the fading light she saw a pair of shoes, polished black leather cap toes, immaculate, not a drop of spilled wine on them. From the mess of her spilled bag, the cheap plastic baby bottle rolled. The plastic scraped lightly against the marble, clack, 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 until it bumped against the toe of that expensive black shoe and settled. Nora closed her eyes, and the world disappeared. Ethan Hayes did not flinch when the glass shattered. He didn't spill a drop of the bourbon in his glass, nor did he break his posture. While the wealthy civilians at the surrounding tables gasped and recoiled, and while Gregory let out an undignified squeak of terror, Ethan simply sat still. Behind him, the subtle shift of fabric and the faint click of safety catches being released signaled that his men, Finn and Matteo, had already drawn their weapons beneath their coats. They formed a tight, protective triangle behind his booth. Ethan's dark, flat eyes tracked the chaos. A hit? Unlikely. Assassins didn't announce their arrival by tripping over a tray stand. A distraction? Possible. He swept his gaze across the restaurant, checking the sight lines, the exits, the hands of the patrons. Nothing. Just terrified socialites staring at the mess on the floor. He finally looked down at the woman. She was sprawled on her side, tangled in the legs of the wooden stand. A pool of dark red Cabernet was inching toward her face, soaking into the frayed ends of her damp hair. She was dangerously thin. The oversized jacket she wore couldn't hide the sharp, prominent jut of her shoulder blades or the fragility of her wrists. Her skin was a sickly, translucent white, tinged with the grey pallor of someone who was running on fumes and panic. "Mr. Hayes, I am so profoundly sorry," Gregory stammered, his face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. "She's a vagrant. A crazy woman from the alley. I'll have her removed immediately. I'll comp your entire evening." Ethan ignored him. His attention was drawn downward, to the object resting against the toe of his shoe. It was a baby bottle. Clear plastic, scuffed from use, with a faded green ring around the rubber nipple. Inside, a milky, off-white liquid sloshed gently. Ethan stared at it. It was a profoundly mundane object, entirely alien in his world. He dealt in shipping manifests, hollow-point ammunition, unmarked bills, and leverage. The presence of a child's bottle at his feet felt like a glitch in reality. He glanced at the spill from her bag. A cheap plastic comb with broken teeth. A wallet held together by duct tape. A crumpled piece of paper that looked like a pawn shop receipt. Get a busboy out here to clean this up! Gregory snapped, snapping his fingers frantically at a terrified waiter. And call the police! Have this trash arrested for trespassing! No police, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the hushed whispers of the room. Yet it hit Gregory like a physical blow. The manager froze, his mouth hanging open. Sir, Gregory whispered. I said, no police, Ethan repeated. He didn't look at Gregory. He looked at Finn. Sweeper, then get her off the floor, the back office. Boss, she could be wired. Finn muttered, his eyes glued to the unconscious woman. If she's wired, she's the worst undercover operative the feds have ever fielded. Ethan said dryly. Sweep her anyway. Be thorough. Matteo stepped forward, effortlessly hauling Nora up by her armpits. She was dead weight, her head lolling backward. Matteo quickly and efficiently patted down her jacket, checked her waistband, and ran a hand down her legs. Clean. Matteo grunted. She's out cold. Smells like rain and stale fry grease. Pulse is weak. Take her to the manager's office. Lock the door. Do not let anyone in. Ethan ordered. Gregory panicked, waving his hands. Mr. Hayes, please, you don't need to involve yourselves in this. My security can toss her out back. Ethan finally looked at Gregory. The expression in Ethan's dark eyes was completely devoid of empathy, warmth, or human grace. It was the look of a predator analyzing a particularly annoying insect. She was coming to you, Gregory. Ethan noted softly. She reached for you right before she went down. She knows you. Gregory swallowed hard, beads of sweat breaking out on his forehead. She used to clean the kitchens, a temporary hire, unstable. We let her go. I see. Ethan reached down, his long fingers wrapping around the plastic baby bottle. It felt slightly sticky. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket in one fluid motion. I'm taking your office for the next 20 minutes, Gregory. If a single employee approaches that door, I will assume they are a threat to my safety, and my men will act accordingly. Do we understand each other? Yes, Mr. Hayes. Absolutely. Ethan walked past the mess, taking the baby bottle and the canvas tote bag with him. Nora woke to the smell of bleach, raw meat, and aged tobacco. It was a confusing cocktail of scents that sent a sharp spike of nausea straight up her esophagus. She gagged, her eyes flying open. She was lying on a leather sofa. The leather was freezing against her damp skin. Her head throbbed with a vicious rhythmic pounding, centered right behind her eyes. She scrambled to sit up, her hands clutching the edge of the sofa cushions. The room spun wildly, tilting like the deck of a sinking ship. She clamped a hand over her mouth, taking deep, shuddering breaths through her nose, fighting down the urge to vomit. Where am I? Fluorescent lights buzzed angrily overhead. She was in a small, windowless office. Filing cabinets, a heavy metal desk, security camera monitors glowing on a side table. Gregory's office. She recognized the cheap motivational posters on the walls from the day she interviewed. Then, reality crashed down on her like a dropped anvil. The restaurant. The fall. The time. She frantically patted her pockets. Empty. Her bag was missing. Looking for this, Nora whipped her head around, a sudden movement that nearly made her black out again. Sitting in a rolling chair in the corner of the room, mostly cloaked in shadows, was a man. He was holding her frayed canvas tote bag in his lap. Beside him, resting on the edge of Gregory's metal desk, was the baby bottle. He was the man from the booth. Up close, he was terrifying. It wasn't just the immaculate charcoal grey suit or the heavy, expensive watch on his wrist. It was the absolute stillness of him. He sat with the relaxed posture of someone who owned the room, the building, and everyone inside it. His face was all harsh angles and cold calculation, his dark hair swept back, a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like she was an algebra problem he couldn't quite solve. "My bag!" Nora gasped out, her voice raspy. She swung her legs off the sofa, her boots hitting the scuffed linoleum. Her knees immediately trembled, threatening to buckle. "Sit down," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Nora ignored him. She forced herself to stand, grabbing the armrest of the sofa for balance. "Give me my bag. I need to leave. What time is it?" Ethan checked his watch. 6:20. A sound of pure, trapped panic escaped Nora's throat. No, I have to go. Mrs. Higgins leaves at 6:30. She'll call child services again. She swore she would." Nora stumbled forward, reaching for the bag. Ethan didn't stand. He simply moved his hand, pulling the bag out of her reach. "Sit the fuck down," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal edge that demanded obedience. "Before you fall and crack your skull open on the floor, and I have to explain to the police why there's a corpse in my impromptu meeting room." Nora froze, hovering over him. She was breathing heavily, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. She looked from his cold, dark eyes down to the baby bottle on the desk. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her tough exterior, built from months of poverty and rejection, fractured. "I don't have time for whatever this is. I just need my things." Ethan watched her sway. She looked like she was held together by frayed string and sheer willpower. Her knuckles, white from gripping the edge of the desk, were raw and cracked from harsh cleaning chemicals. He unzipped her tote bag. "Stop it! You have no right to look through that!" Nora lunged at him. Ethan caught her wrist with his free hand. He didn't squeeze hard, but the grip was absolute, immovable. Her skin felt like ice. Her pulse fluttered frantically against his thumb, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. "You disrupted my dinner," Ethan stated, looking up into her frantic, bloodshot eyes. "You breached a secured perimeter, caused a panic, and dumped a bag of unidentified objects at my feet. In my line of work, people die for less. I am going to look in the bag." He released her wrist with a slight shove backward, forcing her to stumble back and fall heavily onto the leather sofa. She gasped, wrapping her arms around her stomach, curling inward defensively. Ethan reached into the bag and began pulling items out, placing them methodically on the desk. A handful of crumpled $1 bills, $11 total, a past-due notice from the electric company, a half-empty packet of generic ibuprofen, an identification card. Ethan picked up the ID. Nora Davis, 26, organ donor. He tossed it back onto the pile. "You have $11 to your name, Nora Davis, yet you decided to crash a restaurant where the cheapest cut of meat is $150. You have a terrible sense of budgeting." Nora let out a wet, hysterical laugh. It sounded like glass grinding together. "I didn't come to eat, you arrogant prick. I came to get paid." Ethan raised an eyebrow. The insult didn't anger him. It surprised him. Usually when people realized who he was, or at least that he was a man holding a terrifying amount of power, they groveled. They begged. This woman, smelling of cheap soap and starvation, was glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Gregory," Ethan said, piecing it together, "he owes you money. $300! Nora spat, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. "For a month of scraping burnt grease out of his ovens at 2 a.m, he fired me by text. My sitter leaves in 10 minutes. If I don't pay her for the week, she locks the door and she calls the state. If the state finds out my power is shut off. She choked on the words, her throat constricting. She swallowed hard, refusing to cry. I lose my son. Ethan looked at the baby bottle. Similac, the cheap kind. He had noticed the way her jacket hung off her frame, the hollowness of her cheeks. She was starving herself so the child could eat. It was pathetic. It was the kind of human misery Ethan went out of his way to avoid looking at. He dealt in high-level corruption, extortion, and targeted violence. He didn't deal in desperate mothers and hungry infants. It made his skin crawl, an uncomfortable tightening in his chest that felt suspiciously like guilt. He violently rejected the emotion. Who sent you to me? Ethan asked coldly. Nora blinked, confusion momentarily replacing her panic. What? Nobody sent me to you. I don't even know who you are. I was walking toward Gregory. You tripped right at my table. You fell precisely where my guards would have to break formation to deal with you. Ethan leaned forward, his voice a lethal whisper. If I find out you're a scout for the Romanos, evaluating my security detail— Are you insane? Nora interrupted, pushing herself up from the sofa. The dizziness was back, but adrenaline was burning through it. Do you hear yourself? I fainted because I haven't eaten a solid meal in 2 days. I don't give a damn about you or your security guards. You are nothing to me but an obstacle standing between me and my baby. Now give me my bag. She marched up to him, grabbed the canvas tote, and started clumsily sweeping her items off the desk and into the bag. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the bottle of ibuprofen. It scattered pills across the floor. She cursed vividly, dropping to her knees to gather them. Ethan stared down at her. She was on her knees, desperately picking up cheap painkillers from a dirty floor. There was no deception here. No trained operative acted like this. The raw, jagged desperation radiating from her couldn't be faked. She was just collateral damage. A ghost in the machine of the city. And for some reason, the fact that Gregory was exploiting her infuriated Ethan more than a rival family trying to put a bullet in his head. Stop, Ethan said. Nora ignored him, grabbing the last pill and shoving it into her pocket. She grabbed the edge of the desk to pull herself up. Ethan stood. He was a head and a half taller than her, broad-shouldered and imposing. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a silver money clip, thick with $100 bills. He peeled off 500s and tossed them onto the desk. They fluttered down, landing next to the plastic baby bottle. Nora stared at the money. $500, more cash than she had seen in months. What is that? She asked defensively, stepping back. A loan, Ethan said flatly. I don't want your charity. It's not charity, it's an advance. Ethan reached out and picked up her ID card from the desk, slipping it into his own pocket. Nora's eyes widened. Hey, give that back. You owe me for the dry cleaning of the carpet you ruined with your little stunt. Ethan lied effortlessly. Consider the $500 a temporary loan to solve your immediate, logistical issues. You will pay me back. I don't have $500 to pay you back. Then you'll work it off? Ethan said, stepping around the desk, backing her towards the door. My men will take you home. You're in no condition to drive, and you won't make it to your sitter on a bus in 8 minutes. Nora hit the wooden door with her back. She looked up at him, terrified and trapped. I don't know you. I'm not getting in a car with your men. My name is Ethan Hayes, he said, crowding her slightly, letting her feel the danger radiating off him. And you don't have a choice, Nora. If you walk out that door alone, you don't make it to your son. If you take the money and get in the car, you keep your child tonight. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. But make no mistake. I have your ID. I know where you live. You belong to me until this debt is settled. Nora's breath hitched. She looked at the cold, beautiful monster standing in front of her, then over his shoulder at the baby bottle resting near the cash. She was trading one desperate situation for a far more dangerous one. But the thought of the sitter locking the door, the thought of Sam crying in the dark. She gritted her teeth, her pride breaking entirely. She pushed past him, snatched the $500 off the desk, and shoved it into her pocket. She grabbed the baby bottle, holding it tight against her chest like a shield. "Fine," Nora whispered, her voice shaking with unshed tears and pure exhaustion. "Take me to my son." Ethan watched her, an unreadable expression settling over his harsh features. He had just bought a ghost. He wasn't entirely sure why, but as he watched her clutch that plastic bottle, he knew he wasn't letting her disappear back into the alleyways. He opened the door. "Finn, pull the car around." The interior of the armored Cadillac Escalade smelled like ozone, expensive leather conditioner, and the cold metal of holstered sidearms. It was an intimidating, suffocating luxury. Nora sat rigidly in the back seat, her damp utility jacket leaving a dark, shameful stain on the pristine cream upholstery. She hugged the canvas tote and the plastic baby bottle to her chest. Her teeth clicked together in a rapid, involuntary rhythm. The vehicle's heater was blowing warm air over her freezing legs, but the chill was buried deep in her marrow. Ethan sat across from her, a vast expanse of dark wool and sharp angles. He was looking at a tablet, his thumb scrolling with rhythmic precision. He hadn't looked at her since they left the alley behind L'Osteria. Up front, Finn and Matteo were silent. The partition was lowered, but the air was thick with their unspoken confusion. Mob enforcers didn't run taxi services for vagrants. "Take the next left. The lights are timed better." Ethan murmured, not looking up from the screen. Matteo swung the heavy SUV left, the tires hissing violently against the rain-slicked asphalt. Nora checked the dashboard clock. 6:26 p.m. Panic squeezed her lungs. "It's the brick building on the corner, the one with the broken fire escape," she said, her voice sounding frail in the massive cabin. Matteo pulled the Escalade onto a cracked, uneven sidewalk in front of a decaying tenement building. The neighborhood was a wasteland of pawn shops, liquor stores behind wrought iron cages, and overflowing dumpsters. The contrast between the $250,000 vehicle and the squalor of the street was nauseating. Nora grabbed the door handle. It was locked. She turned to Ethan, her eyes wide, breath catching. "Please, it's 28 minutes past." Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were flat, absorbing the panic rolling off her. He tapped a button on the armrest. The heavy locks clicked upward with the finality of a prison gate opening. "Finn goes with you," Ethan said. "I don't need a babysitter. I just need my son." "You have $500 of my money in your pocket, Nora. You're a flight risk." Ethan replied smoothly. "Finn, go." Finn, a massive wall of a man with a broken nose and cauliflower ear, grunted and opened the passenger door. Nora scrambled out, the cold rain hitting her face like a slap. She didn't wait for the giant. She broke into a dead sprint toward the peeling front doors of the building. She took the concrete stairs 2 at a time, her wet boots slipping dangerously, ignoring the screaming protest of her bruised knee. "Apartment 2B." She pounded on the door. 6:29 p.m. The door unlocked with the rattle of 3 separate deadbolts. It swung open a few inches, held by a thick brass chain. Mrs. Higgins peered through the gap. She smelled of cheap menthol cigarettes and wet cat food. "You're late," the older woman rasped, exhaling a cloud of grey smoke into Nora's face. "I'm sorry. The buses—" "I don't care about the buses, Nora. I told you I'm done. The kid cries too much, and you owe me for last week." Mrs. Higgins moved to shut the door. "I'm calling the caseworker." "No, wait." Nora shoved her foot into the crack of the door, the wood biting painfully through the wet canvas of her boot. She dug frantically into her pocket with shaking fingers, pulling out the crumpled wad of $100 bills. She shoved one through the crack. Mrs. Higgins stopped. Her eyes locked onto the crisp, oversized bill. It was more money than Nora had paid her in 3 months combined. "I have it," Nora choked out, tears of sheer relief burning her eyes. "Here, take it. Keep the change. Just give me Sam, please." The chain rattled off. The door opened. Nora practically fell into the suffocating, smoke-filled living room. In the corner, sitting in a cheap, plastic laundry basket lined with a faded blanket, was Sam. He was 10 months old, wearing a threadbare onesie. His face was blotchy and red from crying, his tiny fists balled tight. When he saw her, his lower lip quivered, and he let out a broken, hiccuping wail. "Sammy!" Nora sobbed. She dropped to her knees, scooping the small, warm weight of him into her chest. He smelled like sour milk and unwashed cotton, but to Nora it was the only scent that tethered her to the earth. She buried her face in his fine, sparse hair, rocking him violently. "I'm here, baby. Mama's here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Higgins snatched the $100 bill, holding it up to the bare hallway bulb to check the watermark. "Don't bring him back on Monday. Find someone else." Nora didn't answer. She didn't care. She had him. A shadow fell over the doorway. Finn stood there, filling the entire doorframe. He looked at the squalid apartment, the chain-smoking old woman, and then down at the shivering mother clutching her baby on the stained carpet. His hard, brutalist features twitched slightly. "Time to go, lady." Finn rumbled. Nora tightened her grip on Sam, grabbing the tote bag and the baby bottle. She stood up, her legs trembling under the sudden added weight. She walked past Mrs. Higgins without a word, stepping out into the cold hallway where Finn waited. She was a mother walking into a cage, but at least she wasn't walking alone. The hallway outside Nora's 4th-floor apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and old damp. The single fluorescent bulb overhead flickered erratically, casting sickly, strobe-like shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. Nora dug her key out of her pocket, balancing Sam on her left hip. The baby was exhausted, his cheek pressed flat against her collarbone, his breathing wet and ragged. Finn stood 2 paces behind her. He hadn't spoken since leaving the Escalade. The lock stuck. Nora swore under her breath, jiggling the key frantically. The metal gave way with a harsh scrape, and she pushed the door open. Blackness greeted her. Absolute, freezing blackness. Nora flipped the light switch on the wall out of pure muscle memory. Nothing happened. The dead click echoed in the small space. She stood frozen on the threshold. The ambient temperature in the apartment was colder than the hallway. She could see her own breath pluming faintly in the dim light spilling from the corridor. The electric company hadn't waited until Monday. They had cut the power today. "Lights out," Finn noted gruffly. I need a flashlight. Give me a second." Nora stepped inside. "Hold on." The voice didn't belong to Finn. It was lower, sharper. Nora turned. Ethan Hayes was standing in the hallway, his immaculate wool overcoat unbuttoned. He had followed them up. He looked profoundly out of place, a wolf wandering into a dilapidated rat's nest. He pushed past Finn, stepping over the threshold into Nora's apartment. He pulled a heavy tactical flashlight from his coat pocket and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the dark, violently illuminating Nora's reality. It was a studio apartment. A mattress laid directly on the floor in the corner, covered in mismatched, thin blankets. A tiny kitchenette consisted of a rusted sink, a miniature fridge, and a hot plate. There were no toys, no pictures on the walls, just the brutal, suffocating architecture of poverty, Ethan swept the beam across the room. He hated disorder. He operated an empire built on meticulous ledgers, calculated risks, and absolute control. This room was a monument to failure. It was chaotic. It was unsafe. The flashlight beam settled on Nora. She was standing in the center of the room, shivering violently, her arms wrapped tight around the baby. The infant whimpered, shifting uncomfortably against the cold dampness of her jacket. "You don't have power," Ethan stated. The fact was undeniable, but saying it aloud made it concrete. "I'll pay it tomorrow," Nora said quickly, defensively. "With the money. I just need to call them in the morning. We'll be fine tonight. We have extra blankets." Ethan looked at the mattress. The blankets were threadbare acrylic. The temperature in the room was already dipping below 50 degrees. By 3 a.m. it would be a refrigerator. "The water?" Ethan asked. Nora hesitated. "It's connected to the electric pump in the basement. It's off." "So you have no heat, no light, and no running water to mix the formula for the child." Ethan moved the flashlight beam to the plastic baby bottle sticking out of her tote bag. "How exactly are you feeding him tonight, Nora? Are you mixing the powder with bottled water and feeding him cold milk in a freezing room?" Nora flinched as if he had struck her. Shame, hot and acidic, burned the back of her throat. "Get out. You made sure I didn't run. I have your money, and I will do whatever manual labor you want me to do to pay it back. But you don't get to stand in my home and judge me. I own your debt." Ethan replied, his voice dangerously soft. "That means I own the collateral, and right now my collateral is standing in a freezing room, risking pneumonia for herself and her child because of stubborn pride." "It's not pride, it's survival," she snapped back, her voice breaking. Sam startled at her volume, letting out a sharp, frightened cry. Nora immediately hushed him, pacing the small floor space, bouncing him desperately. "Shh, baby, I'm sorry. Mama's sorry." Ethan watched the frantic, imperfect mothering. In his world, weakness was a liability that was quickly exploited and eliminated. If one of his lieutenants showed this level of operational failure, they would be buried in a landfill by dawn. But looking at the infant burying its face into the damp fabric of Nora's jacket, Ethan didn't feel the urge to eliminate. He felt an aggressive, deeply irritating compulsion to fix the error. He didn't do charity. He didn't save people. It's an investment. His clinical, sociopathic mind rationalized. A dead debtor cannot repay $500. A sick woman cannot work. The environment is suboptimal. The asset must be relocated. He clicked the flashlight off. The darkness swallowed them again. "Finn," Ethan commanded from the blackness. "Yeah, boss. Get a bag. Pack whatever she needs for the child. Clothes, formula, diapers. Leave the rest of this garbage." Nora's breath hitched. "What? No, what are you doing?" Ethan stepped closer to her in the dark. She couldn't see his face, but she could smell him. The expensive bourbon, the wool, the faint metallic tang of the cold outside air. "You aren't staying here," Ethan said. "You're coming with me. I am not taking my baby to a mob boss's house." Nora backed away until her shoulders hit the plaster wall. "You are currently standing in a dark box that is 45 degrees and dropping. You have no food and no water. If you stay here, the child gets sick. If the child gets sick, you take him to a hospital. The hospital reports you to child services for negligence, and they take him away. Permanently." Ethan's voice was a flat, ruthless blade, slicing away every defense she had. "Or you get in my car. You sleep in a room with a thermostat. The boy drinks warm milk. You pay off your debt by managing one of my properties. It is a simple calculation, Nora. Choose." She stood against the wall in the pitch black. The baby shivered violently against her chest. She hated him. She hated his expensive shoes and his cold logic. She hated that he had stripped away her dignity and laid bare her absolute failure to protect her son. But most of all, she hated that he was right. Nora closed her eyes, hot tears finally spilling over her cold lashes, tracking down her dirty cheeks. "Pack the bag," she whispered into the dark. The brownstone in Brooklyn was an anomaly. From the street, it looked like every other multi-million-dollar row house in the gentrified neighborhood. Dark brick, heavy oak doors, and discreetly frosted windows. Inside, it was a fortress, the door locked behind them with a heavy magnetic thud that sounded distinctly like the ceiling of a vault. The foyer smelled of lemon oil, old wood, and the faint, sterile scent of bleach. The floors were dark mahogany, the walls painted a stark gallery white. There was no art, no personal touches. It was a space designed purely for function and security. Finn dropped Nora's hastily packed duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Matteo was already sweeping the first floor, checking window locks out of sheer habit. "Third floor, first door on the right," Ethan said, stripping off his wool overcoat and tossing it over the back of a leather chair. He loosened his silk tie, the first concession to comfort he had made all night. "There's an ensuite bathroom. Towels are in the cabinet. Kitchen is down the hall. Heat the child's food." Nora stood in the foyer, dripping rainwater onto the expensive floor. Sam was asleep again, a heavy, exhausted slump against her shoulder. She felt entirely unmoored. The transition from the freezing, chaotic terror of her apartment to this silent, sterile fortress gave her severe whiplash. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice echoed slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the crystal decanter sitting on a side table. He didn't look at her immediately. He poured 3 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. "You owe me a debt," he said finally, turning to face her. "You will serve as the housekeeper for this property. You will maintain it, keep it stocked, and stay out of the way when I or my associates are conducting business. Consider this room and board in advance on your wages." "I knocked over a tray of wine glasses," Nora said, her voice shaking with disbelief and exhaustion. "People don't kidnap women and their babies to clean their floors over spilled wine. What do you really want from me?" Ethan took a slow sip of the bourbon. The burn grounded him. She was right, of course. It was an absurdly illogical move. Keeping a civilian, a mother no less, inside a secured safe house was a massive operational vulnerability. If the Romanos found out, they would use her as leverage. He looked at her. Her wet hair was plastered to her skull. Her eyes were sunken, bruised with exhaustion. She was holding the child so fiercely her knuckles were white. She looked like a cornered animal, expecting the killing blow at any moment. "I don't want anything from you, Nora, other than a clean kitchen and quiet," Ethan said, his voice dropping to that cold, dangerous register that demanded an end to the conversation. "Don't flatter yourself into thinking you're part of some grand conspiracy. You were a mess on my floor. I abhor messes. Now I am fixing it. Go upstairs and feed the boy." He turned his back on her, walking toward the heavy oak doors of the study. Nora watched him go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't trust him. A man like that didn't do favors. He bought assets. He collected debts. And now, Shay and Sam belonged to him. But as she climbed the heavy wooden staircase, her boots sinking into the plush runner, the ambient heat of the house wrapped around her like a physical blanket. Her shivering finally stopped. She opened the door to the room. It was massive. A king-sized bed dominated the center, piled high with thick, white down comforters. Heavy blackout curtains covered the windows. The silence in the room was absolute. Nora laid Sam gently on the center of the massive bed. He didn't stir, his small chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. She stared at him for a long moment, the crushing weight of the day finally pressing down on her spine. She walked into the pristine, marble-tiled bathroom and turned on the faucet. Hot water rushed out instantly. She washed her face, watching the dirt and grease from the restaurant kitchen swirl down the drain. She looked at herself in the mirror. A ghost. A tired, desperate ghost who had just sold herself to the devil. 10 minutes later, Nora was in the third-floor kitchenette. She found a stainless steel pot, filled it with water, and turned on the induction stove. She placed the cheap plastic baby bottle, filled with the last of her formula powder and bottled water, into the pot to warm. She leaned her hip against the marble counter, staring blankly at the water beginning to simmer. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Soft. Measured. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had discarded his suit jacket entirely. The sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt rolled up to his forearms, revealing a dark web of ink wrapping around his left wrist. He was holding a plate with a thick, heavily loaded sandwich and a glass of water. He walked into the kitchen and set the plate down on the marble island next to her. "Eat," he ordered. Nora stared at the food. Thick slices of roasted turkey, sharp cheddar, fresh bread. Her stomach gave a violent, painful lurch, twisting into a knot of sheer hunger. Saliva flooded her mouth. She looked up at him. "Is this added to my tab?" she asked bitterly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Just eat the damn food, Nora." He didn't leave. He stood on the opposite side of the island, leaning against the counter, watching her. Nora hesitated, then reached out with a trembling hand and picked up half the sandwich. She took a bite. The taste of actual solid food was so overwhelming she closed her eyes, a small, pathetic sound escaping her throat. She ate fast, desperately, the manners of polite society stripped away by starvation. Ethan watched the frantic way she consumed the food. He looked from her to the cheap plastic bottle sitting in the boiling water. In a world defined by blood, iron, and absolute ruthlessness, the sight of the worn bottle bobbing in the expensive pot felt like an anchor. It was completely out of place. Just like him. Just like her. Nora finished the sandwich in less than 2 minutes. She reached for the bottle, pulling it from the water and shaking it. She tested a drop of the milk on the inside of her raw wrist. It was perfectly warm. She looked across the marble island at the mobster who had bought her life for $500. "Thank you," she said. The words tasted like ash, but they were true. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the gratitude. He simply pushed away from the counter and walked back toward the dark hallway. "Lock your door," he said over his shoulder. "Mateo takes the night shift. He has a habit of checking rooms. He won't bother you if the deadbolt is thrown." And then he was gone, leaving Nora alone in the sterile warmth, holding a bottle of warm milk, trapped in a sanctuary built by a monster. 3 weeks passed. The brownstone settled into a bizarre, tense rhythm. Nora scrubbed. She attacked the already immaculate house with a desperate, frantic energy, trying to sweat out the anxiety of her captivity. She learned the exact chemical smell of the stone sealer used on the foyer marble. She memorized the heavy, oiled metal click of Finn dismantling his sidearm at the kitchen island every Tuesday morning. She grew accustomed to the suffocating silence of the house during the day, and the low, dangerous murmur of men in heavy coats arriving after midnight. She was paying her debt. She kept a meticulous tally on a notepad in her room. $15 an hour for deep cleaning, $20 for cooking. She factored in the cost of Sam's formula, the diapers Mateo silently dropped outside her door on Fridays, the electricity, the water. By her math, she still owed Ethan $340. Ethan, for his part, remained a ghost who occupied the same physical space. He didn't make small talk. He left before she brought Sam down for the morning, the scent of his espresso and dark roast tobacco lingering in the kitchen air like a phantom. When he was home, he was locked in his study. The first time their worlds actually collided was on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Nora was in the massive living room, a bottle of lemon polish in one hand and a microfiber cloth in the other. Sam was on the floor, doing his wobbly, uneven army crawl across an authentic Persian rug that probably cost more than Nora's life insurance policy. The front door unlocked with its heavy magnetic thud. Nora froze, her rag hovering over the mahogany coffee table. Ethan walked in. It was 2 p.m., an odd time for him to return. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his tie missing. He looked tired, the sharp angles of his face cast in harsh shadows by the grey light filtering through the windows. He stopped in the archway of the living room, his dark eyes landing on the baby. Sam had stopped crawling. The infant sat up, a threadbare stuffed rabbit gripped in one chubby fist, and stared at the towering, terrifying man. Nora's breath caught. She stepped forward, her maternal instinct screaming to snatch her child off the floor, but she forced herself to stay still. Ethan hated sudden movements. Ethan stared at the boy. The boy stared back. Then Sam dropped the rabbit. He let out a loud, wet babble, slapped his hands against the expensive wool rug, and began aggressively crawling toward Ethan's polished leather shoes. "Sam, no!" Nora gasped, rushing forward. She wasn't fast enough. Sam reached Ethan's feet, grabbed the crisp crease of the man's suit trousers with his sticky, formula-coated fingers, and pulled himself up to a wobbly stand. The baby let out a triumphant squeal, grinning a gummy, open-mouthed smile up at the mob boss. Nora stopped dead, 2 feet away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for the reprimand, for the cold, dismissive command to remove the child. Ethan looked down. He didn't pull his leg away. He didn't brush the sticky hand off his trousers. He just stood entirely still, looking at the small, fragile weight leaning against his shin. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan crouched down. His knees cracked slightly in the quiet room. He was now eye level with Sam. The contrast was jarring, the hardened, scarred face of a killer inches away from the soft, unblemished cheeks of an infant. Ethan reached out. His hand, large and calloused, scarred across the knuckles, hovered over Sam's head. Then, with a hesitant, almost jerky motion, he laid his palm flat against the baby's fine hair. Sam leaned into the touch, letting out a soft coo. Ethan's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Nora's terrified face. The expression in his eyes wasn't cold, it was fractured. For a split second, the impenetrable armor cracked, revealing a profound, terrifying isolation underneath. "His grip," Ethan murmured, his voice scraping like gravel. "It's getting stronger." He didn't wait for a reply. He stood up smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. He stepped around the baby, completely ignoring the damp handprint left on his trousers, and walked down the hall toward his study. Nora sank to her knees on the rug, pulling Sam tightly into her chest, burying her face in his neck. She smelled baby powder and the faint, lingering scent of Ethan's sandalwood cologne. Her hands shook. She realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that she wasn't just afraid of Ethan Hayes anymore. She was starting to understand him. And that was far, far more dangerous. The illusion of safety shattered at 3:14 a.m. on a Sunday. Nora was jolted awake by the violent slam of the heavy oak front door. It wasn't the usual controlled thud. It was a desperate, panicked crash that vibrated through the floorboards of her third-floor bedroom. Then came the voices. "Keep pressure on it! Damn it, keep your hand flat!" Finn's voice, a gravelly roar stripped of its usual stoicism. "I got him! I got him! Get the kit from the kitchen!" Matteo, breathless and frantic. Nora sat up, her blood turning to ice water. She looked at Sam's crib. He was fast asleep, dead to the world. She threw back the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood. She didn't think. Instinct, raw and chaotic, took over. She ran down the dark staircase, her oversized sleep shirt billowing around her knees. She hit the foyer and stopped dead. The air smelled violently of copper, ozone, and wet wool. Ethan was slumped against the white gallery wall. His dark overcoat was thrown on the floor. His white dress shirt was completely soaked, plastered to his left side in a massive, expanding stain of blackish red. He was breathing in shallow, wet gasps. His face was grey, the skin tight over his cheekbones, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Matteo had both hands pressed hard against Ethan's ribs, his own hands slick with blood. Finn was tearing through the kitchen cabinets, the sound of breaking glass and swearing echoing down the hall. "He's slipping, Finn! The artery's nicked!" Matteo yelled, panic raising his pitch. Nora didn't run away. She didn't scream. The years of poverty, of panic, of managing crises with nothing but adrenaline and duct tape kicked in. She pushed off the bottom stair. "Move!" she ordered. Matteo looked up, startled. "Nora, get back upstairs." "I said move!" She dropped to her knees on the marble floor beside them. She didn't care about the blood soaking into her bare legs. "You're pressing on his ribs, not the wound. You have to pack it." She shoved Matteo's hands aside. The heat of Ethan's blood was shocking. It coated her palms instantly. She found the tear in the fabric, slipping her fingers inside the wet shirt. The wound was jagged, deep. A bullet graze that had torn through muscle and found a vein. Ethan let out a harsh, guttural groan as her fingers pressed directly into the torn flesh. His eyes snapped open, locking onto her face. His hand shot out, his bloody fingers wrapping around her wrist in a vice grip. "Nora!" he choked out, his breath hot and metallic against her face. "Go! Away! Shut up!" she snapped, her voice shaking but her hands steady. She pressed down with all her weight, the heel of her hand digging violently into his side. "Finn, where is the gauze?" Finn slid across the foyer floor, dumping a green tactical medical kit next to her knees. "Here. Open it. Give me the hemostatic dressing. The yellow packet. Now." For the first time in his life, the massive enforcer took an order from a 110-pound woman in an oversized t-shirt. He ripped the packet open. Nora didn't hesitate. "Matteo, hold his shoulders down. This is going to hurt him." She pulled her hand away, the blood instantly welling up. She shoved the chemically treated gauze directly into the wound, packing it tight. Ethan roared. It was an animal sound, raw and agonizing. His back arched off the floor, his muscles snapping taut. He squeezed Nora's wrist so hard she felt the bones grind, but she didn't flinch. She kept her weight fully on his side, leaning over him, her hair falling into her face. "Look at me," she demanded, her voice cutting through his pain. "Ethan, look at me!" His eyes found hers, blown wide, swimming in agony. "Breathe," she ordered. "Just look at me and breathe. I've got it. I've got it." He stared at her. He saw the absolute terror in her eyes, warring with an unbreakable, stubborn defiance. She had blood on her face. Her hands were buried in his chest. In the middle of his violent, chaotic world, she was the only solid thing. The bleeding slowed. The hemostatic gauze did its job. Finn wrapped a pressure bandage around Ethan's torso, hauling him off the floor and carrying him toward the downstairs bedroom. Matteo followed. barking orders into a burner phone for a private doctor. Nora was left alone in the foyer. She sat back on her heels. The white marble floor looked like a slaughterhouse. Her hands were stained dark crimson. The smell of copper was so thick she tasted it on her tongue. She started shaking. A violent, full-body tremor that rattled her teeth. She was in too deep. The illusion was gone. This wasn't a strict landlord and a housekeeper. He was a monster who bled, and she was the woman pressing her hands into the wound. She looked down at her bloody palms. She should be terrified. She should be packing her bag and running into the night. But as she sat in the blood, the only thought echoing in her mind was a desperate, fierce prayer that he wouldn't die. The morning sun cut through the gaps in the kitchen blinds, painting harsh, bright lines across the marble island. Nora stood at the sink, running her hands under scalding hot water. She had scrubbed them raw with dish soap and a bristle brush, but the faint, rusty shadow of blood still clung to the cuticles of her fingernails. The house was dead quiet. The private doctor had come and gone hours ago. Finn and Matteo were standing guard outside, smoking in the cold morning air. A heavy, shuffling footstep sounded in the hallway. Nora turned off the water, drying her raw hands on a towel. Ethan stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. He was shirtless, his chest and torso wrapped heavily in thick white bandages. The skin around his eyes was bruised, a sickly yellowish purple. He was leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his knuckles white. He didn't say anything. He walked slowly, painfully, to one of the high stools at the kitchen island and sat down. He looked at the coffee pot. Nora didn't ask. She grabbed a mug, poured it black, and set it on the marble in front of him. "Thank you." His voice was a rasp, completely devoid of its usual lethal authority. "You shouldn't be out of bed," Nora said quietly. She didn't move away. She stood on the opposite side of the counter, leaning her weight against the lower cabinets. Ethan took a slow sip of the coffee. His dark eyes flicked up, meeting hers. The barrier between them was gone. The cold, calculating distance he always maintained had bled out on the foyer floor. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants. He pulled out 2 items and set them on the marble counter, sliding them across the smooth surface toward her. Her state-issued ID card. And a piece of paper, folded in half. Nora picked up the paper. It was her handwritten ledger, the tally of her debt. At the bottom, where the remaining balance $340 was written, Ethan had drawn a thick, heavy line through the number in black ink. Underneath, he had written one word: settled. Nora stared at the paper. Her chest constricted, a sudden sharp panic flooding her lungs. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice cracked. "Your debt is paid," Ethan said flatly. He stared into his coffee mug. "I had Finn secure an apartment in Queens. First and last month's rent is handled. The utilities are in a fake name, fully paid for a year. You leave today." The silence in the kitchen became a physical weight. This was it. The freedom she had been violently, desperately craving for 3 weeks. She had her son. She had a home. She was free of the monster. She looked at the ledger. Then she looked at the empty space on the counter. Beside the coffee pot sat Sam's cheap plastic baby bottle, freshly washed and drying on a rack. Right next to it, resting on the marble, was a hollow point 9mm bullet Finn had accidentally dropped from his magazine last night. Plastic and lead, a mother and a killer. "Why?" Nora asked. Ethan finally looked at her. The exhaustion in his face was profound. "Because you put your hands in my blood, Nora. You stepped into my world. If you stay here, my enemies will eventually find out about you. About the boy. They will use you to gut me. I will not allow that to happen. You are a liability. I saved your life last night, and that is precisely why you have to go," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "I am a dead man walking, Nora. I have been for 10 years, but when I was bleeding out on that floor, all I could think about was the fact that my blood was ruining your hands." He closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "I have never cared about collateral damage, but I care about you, and that makes me weak. Leave before my weakness gets your son killed." Nora stood perfectly still. The logic was sound. It was the calculus of a mob boss. Cold, protective, ruthless. She picked up the state ID card. The plastic felt cold against her raw fingertips. She looked at her own face in the terrible DMV photo. A desperate, terrified girl who would do anything to survive. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She had walked through the fire. She had seen the monster bleed, and she had packed his wounds. Nora set the ID down on the counter. She reached out and picked up her handwritten ledger. Slowly, deliberately, she tore the paper in half. The sound of tearing paper was deafening in the quiet kitchen. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He stared at her, shock radiating off his harsh features. She tore the pieces again, dropping the shredded paper into the trash can beside the sink. "Nora, what are you doing?" "Math," she said. She crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin, looking the underboss of the Brooklyn Syndicate dead in the eye. "You owe me, Ethan. You owe me a life. I held your artery closed. My hands are stained. You don't get to buy me off with a cheap apartment in Queens to ease your conscience. You don't understand the danger. I survived a freezing apartment with no food and a crying baby, while a floor manager ignored my calls." Nora interrupted, her voice steady, hard as iron. "I know danger, but I also know that out there nobody is coming to save us." "In here? You would burn the city down before you let anyone touch my son." Ethan stared at her, entirely disarmed. The lethal predator was utterly paralyzed by a woman in an oversized sleep shirt. "You're insane," he breathed out. "I'm a criminal, Nora. I kill people." "I know," Nora said simply. "And I know how to get blood out of the marble." She walked around the kitchen island. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, smelling the iodine, the coffee, the sweat. She reached out, laying her raw, red hand gently against the uninjured side of his jaw. His skin was warm. Ethan stopped breathing. He leaned into her palm, a microscopic shift, yielding entirely to her touch. The monster surrendered. "You aren't sending me away, Ethan," Nora whispered, her thumb brushing against the rough stubble on his cheek. "We're staying." Ethan looked at her, the darkness in his eyes shifting, making room for something terrifying and deeply, permanently human. He raised his hand, wrapping his heavy, scarred fingers over hers, holding her hand against his face. The plastic baby bottle rested quietly beside the bullet. Two different worlds, irreversibly fused together in the quiet light of a Brooklyn morning. When survival collides with power, the lines between captive and savior blur completely. Did Nora make the right choice staying with a monster, or did she just seal her own fate in the underworld? Drop a comment below and let us know if you think this dark romance will survive the cartel wars. If you felt every heartbeat of this gritty story, hit that like button, share it with your fellow drama addicts, and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss the next intense, emotional ride. See you in the next story.